government. In today's video, we're going to look at two more campaigns that occurred during the War of 1812. The first will be a continuation of the American effort to invade and influence the residents of Canada. And in the second campaign will be a British response, where they invade the United States and actually succeed in capturing the national capital, Washington, D.C., and burning the White House, among other public buildings. But first, let's look at the campaign that is a continuation of the effort in Canada. Following the 5 July 1814 Battle of Chippewa, the British retreated back to Fort George, a strong position on Lake Ontario near the mouth of the Niagara River. American General Brown followed the enemy, but without heavy cannon, he could not successfully besiege that fort. The Americans established their headquarters at Queenstown, several miles south of St. George, until the 24th of July, when the Americans moved back to the Chippewa River to resupply. British light infantry and Indians followed as far as Lundy's Lane, 4 miles north of the Americans' new position, to ensure that the Americans would not initiate a surprise attack. On the 25th of July, British General Gordon Drummond arrived at Fort George and took personal command of all British forces in the region. He ordered British troops already on the United States side of the Niagara River to move south, hoping that General Brown would withdraw back across the river to block that move. General Brown, however, thought the enemy commander had divided his army, giving him an opportunity, and he advanced on the British to Lundy's Lane. American troops arrived at Lundy's Lane, a mile west of Niagara Falls, about 6 o'clock in the evening of the 25th of July, and formed up to attack while coming under effective fire from British artillery. General Scott sent a battalion to outflank the British position, and those troops were able to surprise arriving British units who were in the process of deploying. When General Brown ordered the 21st Infantry, commanded by Colonel James Miller, to attack and seize the British guns, the colonel replied, "I'll try, sir," and he did it. His response has become the motto of the 5th Infantry, which absorbed the 21st Infantry during a later reorganization. Both armies then conducted a series of attacks and counterattacks in the dark, and the confused fighting resulted in serious casualties for both sides, leaving units depleted and intermixed on the battlefield. Generals Brown and Scott were both wounded during the desperate charges and countercharges before the fight finally sputtered out about midnight. General Brown ordered a withdrawal, and the troops, unmolested by the British, who were not able to pursue, began marching back to Fort Erie. The Americans destroyed much of their supplies to free up room in their wagons for their many wounded. Although left in possession of the battlefield, the British had been roughly handled, and after burying their own dead and burning the American dead in large fires, they withdrew back to Fort George. The fighting had been persistent and at close quarters, and casualties were high for both sides. The British suffered 84 killed, 559 wounded, and 225 men missing or captured, while the Americans had 174 killed, 572 men wounded, and 127 men missing or captured by the British. The battle was a tactical draw, but a strategic victory for the British, as the American advance into Canada was stalled, although they managed to occupy Fort Erie until the end of the war. Much of the fighting at Lundy's Lane had been hand-to-hand with men using bayonets, and veteran British officers who had campaigned against the French during the Peninsular War were horrified by the savagery and the carnage that they witnessed at Lundy's Lane. Impressed with the aggressiveness and the tenacity of his American adversaries, General Drummond reported, Of so determined a character were the American attacks directed against our guns that our artillery crews were bayoneted by the enemy in the very act of loading their cannon, and the muzzles of the enemy's guns were advanced to within a few yards of our own. The balance of combat power on the Niagara Peninsula had swung from the invaders to the British defenders. And now we're going to take a look at the British invasion of the United States, specifically their efforts to occupy Washington, D.C., and the actions that they took once they were in possession of that city. The campaign, entitled Bladensburg, 1814, actually commemorates the name of the town that the British captured en route to Washington, D.C. The Royal Navy cruised Chesapeake Bay during the summer of 1813, raiding the countryside, carrying off livestock and plunder, and burning towns at will, but their operations were limited to targets that were accessible from their ships. Now that Napoleon was in exile on the island of Elba off the coast of Italy, the British were free to prosecute their war with the United States using greater force. A brigade of veterans commanded by General Robert Ross was ordered to effect a diversion on the coast of the United States of America in favor of the army employed in the defense of Canada. While General Ross commanded the troops, the commander-in-chief of the North American station, Admiral Alexander Cochrane, was responsible for deciding the point of attack, and the fleet, which now included 20 loaded transports, entered Chesapeake Bay. Admiral Cochrane initiated two diversions, one toward Baltimore, commanded by General Ross, and another up the Potomac River to raid Alexandria, Virginia. The purpose of that particular effort was to draw the attention of the American defenders in Washington. The main force, commanded by General Ross, landed near Baltimore and attacked the town of Lower Marlborough on 16 June, only 18 miles from Washington. The news galvanized President Madison into action. On the 2nd of July, he ordered the creation of a military district to protect Washington and Baltimore, and directed the army to deploy and the militia to stand by. President Madison also named General William Henry Winder, a Maryland lawyer with little military experience, to command. Secretary of War John Armstrong was upset by what he described as amateurism and panic, and he undercut the president's orders at every turn. He insisted the capital was in no danger, and the campaign to capture Canada must have every priority, thus ensuring very little was accomplished to counter a possible British attack on the national capital, Washington. General Ross had landed his army of 4,300 men, 3 artillery pieces, but without cavalry. His force consisted of regular sailors and a battalion of former slaves called the Corps of Colonial Marines. In Washington, confusion reigned supreme, but American General Winder was eventually able to collect 1,000 regulars, 7,000 poorly trained and largely undependable local militia, and assorted civilian volunteers. He then marched to confront the British. After a brief clash with the enemy, he realized that Bladensburg, only 9 miles northeast of Washington, was the key to defending that city. On 22 August, the Americans established a strong defensive position on high ground across the river from Bladensburg, which dominated the British approach. Early the next morning, the local commander panicked and pulled back across the river to establish new defensive positions in the town and behind the town without destroying the bridge. In the meantime, General Winder returned to Washington to consult with his leaders, and after discussions with the President and the Secretary of War, he rejoined a confused army, preparing poorly sited positions with various organizations arriving from all points of the compass. At noon on 24 August, President Madison rode out to Bladensburg with a Washington contingent and was astonished to discover that the British were even then crossing the river and entering the town using the undestroyed bridge. The British column, suffering in the near 100-degree heat, formed up and assaulted the poorly deployed Americans. After conferring briefly with General Winder, the President and Secretary Armstrong watched the initial fighting before they returned to Washington. As the enemy pressed the attack, American defenses collapsed. News of the Army's retreat soon reached Washington and caused President and Mrs. Madison to flee, but not before the President's wife removed Gilbert Stuart's painting of George Washington from its frame and took it with them for safekeeping. Derisively referred to as the Bladensburg races, the battle actually saw some hard fighting before General Winder ordered American troops to fall back. The result was a hasty and disorganized retreat, and the British occupied Washington that very evening, searching in vain for someone who would surrender the city. The following day, they withdrew and returned to their ships after burning the Capitol, the White House, and a dockyard and a frigate under construction. British casualties were 64 dead and 185 wounded, some of them collapsing from heat exhaustion. The Americans suffered 26 men killed and 51 wounded, although there were 120 Americans taken prisoner, while the militia faded away. Conflicting orders to stand and fight and also to retreat caused Private Henry Fulford of the Maryland militia to make his own choice, and he ran for his life. He was later quoted as saying, "I shaped my course for the woods in the rear, where I intended to lay down and take a rest, but almost fatigued to death with the bullets and grape shot flying like hailstones, I was compelled to make headway for a swamp." American Colonel J. Lovell also later recalled, "Having arrived at the Capitol, I was informed that the President's house was the place before which the Army was to be reformed. I soon arrived before the President's house, but saw no army, nor the symptoms of any. I could not believe that the city was going to be given up without a fight. When I received orders to follow the army, which had passed through Georgetown 2 hours before us, and then, with a heart full of sorrow, grief, and indignation, ordered my troops to follow." And thus ended the Bladensburg campaign, which actually centered on the capture of Washington, D.C., the burning of the Capitol, the White House, and other federal buildings. And now stay tuned for the next video, which will cover the attack on Baltimore and the final battle of the War of 1812, the defense of New Orleans. And until then, all the best to each and every one, and God bless the United States.